And here we are, chapter 6, part 2. So part 2 is around recognizing assault and getting help. Now, as we mentioned, some of the stuff we're going to talk about in chapter 6 is a little bit tougher. This is probably the toughest section. So some people might be asking, well, why do we have to look at this stuff? Isn't it enough to know that sexual assault happens and some of the preventative stuff? And what I have learned through being a counselor and working with people after this stuff has happened in real life is one of the most confusing things and one of the biggest blocks for people in getting help and recognizing what happened to them is that they didn't actually know. And what they thought it was going to feel like or look like wasn't what happened. And so they were very confused, and it made it a lot harder for them to get help or get support and to know that they didn't have to feel the way that they were feeling as long as they did. So this has made it very clear for me, the work that I've done, that the more we know and the more we can understand about ourselves, about this issue, the more informed we're going to be, and then the better prepared we're going to be in case anything ever does happen. And that might not even just be us. It might be to a friend. You might be chatting one day with one of your buddies or one of your girlfriends or whoever, and they might tell you a story and be like, they tell it as a joke usually, and you end up knowing from what we've talked about what you're actually hearing. And you're then maybe better able to support someone else as well if they've gone through something that's not okay. So we're going to take a little look. Remember, we talked about if this does bring up anything for you, or if you have been through anything yourself, you need to hit pause, you need to take a break. That's totally fine. But we are going to kind of look at a little bit of some of what sexual assault actually feels like if you're the one going through it. So the first things to know, or some of the bits we've already talked a little bit about, is those sort of second and bottom floor responses of that survival house and what can happen. So remember, the second floor, that's freeze and appease, tend and befriend, and the fight or flight type reactions. That's sort of a way of encompassing anything your body starts to do that makes you want to fix it to make this problem or this threat feeling go away. The third floor responses or the bottom floor is that sort of shut down feeling. Now, sometimes it's hard to recognize what that is if we're in the middle of it, because it doesn't always feel like an emergency. We don't necessarily feel like screaming or running or crying or any of these things. Our body just goes a little bit numb, and we might have a moment of, I feel kind of weird. And that sometimes is our first moment to recognize some of this other stuff. So the shutdown feeling, there's something to notice, which is called flat affect. That's a fancy way of saying you have no expression, especially up through the top parts of your face here. You don't get a lot of expression, especially in your eyes, but so your face is fairly neutral too. So you sort of look a little bit dazed, and you can't get your face to respond if you wanted it to. So it kind of looks a little like this. Like you don't have this sort of expressive or like enthusiastic, whatever, any of these sort of scrunchy movie facial expressions don't happen. You're just sort of a little zoned because that's this top part of remember that body diagram of your nervous system. This part disengages and you're now down through here in your nervous system. The other thing is also your voice is affected. So normally if your voice goes up and down, like mine kind of is doing right now, it ends up kind of going one tone, that there's only one note that happens, and it's just monotone, right? So that's another sign we've left this part of our nervous system. We're down here. So we lose that. It's called prosody of your voice doing that. The way your memory feels is sequence sometimes feels off. You sometimes can't remember what just happened and what happened first and what happened second. It's like you had a puzzle in your head, but instead of seeing all the pieces in the order of the puzzle so you see the full picture, it's like someone kind of shook up the puzzle pieces and scattered them on the table, and you can see all the pieces, but you can't always remember where they all went. We also remember our language is in the top floor of that house, in that little bookshelf, right? Books are written in words, And when we're in that second or bottom floor, we're very far away from that language. So sometimes finding words to describe the experience, we might think more in images, or we might think more in emotions than we do in actual words. Finding words, finding language becomes very hard sometimes when this is happening. So if you suddenly start to find yourself struggling to find the words that you're trying to say, this could be a sign you might not be in that top floor of the house anymore. You might, again, have sort of a sense of emotions, feelings, smells, or images, but not being able to put that storyline together. So each of those sort of things from the house we've talked about could be happening. Another thing that often happens and that people don't always talk about, and this is going to be, again, a little more intense to talk about for a second, but it's the fact that even though something is unwanted and we don't want it to be happening, sometimes our bodies will still physically react in sort of a arousal way. Sometimes even orgasms happen in sexual assaults, even when we don't want to be in that experience. And people might say, and a lot of people will argue, well, if you didn't want it, why did you, whatever, right? Why did your body react? All those things. We looked at those myths back in the earlier chapters. But in this one in specific, I want you to think of it kind of like what might happen is if someone like is bugging you and tickling you and you don't want to be tickled. Your body has these certain reactions that happen, and your body will laugh if you're tickled, even if you don't want to be. And this can actually happen in the case of a sexual assault. So if your body reacted and you're confused afterwards, did I actually want that thing or not? If you said no, / if you didn't say yes, then it actually doesn't matter what your body wanted or not. The thing that happened still wasn't okay. So that's a really important note, because that can be very confusing for people if they don't know that ahead of time. They can talk themselves out of whatever happened not being okay, which we'll actually talk about next. This is something called cognitive dissonance. Okay, so cognitive dissonance, again, it's a big fancy term for a way of saying our brain really likes what we believe and what our reality is to match. So if we like the color blue, we buy blue things, we are, in the same zone. What our reality is showing our belief system. If we believe something, we want our reality to match. Now, most of us have the privilege of walking through our early life, especially without the label of victim or survivor, without being that person that something bad has happened to. So that's the belief system. If our reality then changes, something bad happens to us, that original label we had in our head of not being that sort of victim or survivor is now up for debate. And our brains don't like to do that. We're like, no, I wasn't that person. I'm not that person. I don't want to be that person. So sometimes what our brain then does is tries to change the experience in our heads. We rewrite the story so it doesn't have to match up with this bad thing. We say, oh, that didn't really count, or maybe I did really want it, or maybe it was just a misunderstanding, or it's not that big of a deal. And we discount or we talk ourselves out of it. It's very common, very human. If you find your brain doing this, it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. But it is important to notice that this might happen, so that if it does start happening, you can kind of ask yourself, is this that cognitive dissonance that Cheryl lady was talking about? Right? And then that would be a moment you can talk to someone from an external point of view, a trusted someone, a parent, teacher, therapist, whoever, that can then help help you see maybe the broader picture of what happened. The next one is around the fact that our emotional reactions might not be what we are expecting. In the moment of an assault happening, we might not find ourselves, as we might imagine, feeling terrified. Again, one of the issues is because sometimes this is with someone we already do know, we're usually not terrified of that person. We end up sort of feeling more confused. Like, why is this happening? I like this person. I thought they were a safe person. And then so that confusion is usually the first feeling people have, more than terrified. You might feel all of these. I'm just saying these are some of the opposite or alternative things that we're not always sort of considering. We usually expect to be terrified. And if we are, at least that matches and we might be able to respond. But if we feel anything other than that, sometimes we're confused. That's why we're looking at all of these things. It's not that you're going to experience one thing or the other. It's that you want to understand it could be a whole array of possibilities. And just because it doesn't look a certain way doesn't mean it's not happening. And the more you can recognize the broad spectrum of things, the better chance you have of being able to access some of these skills we've been practicing and being able to get help afterwards if anything does happen. So emotional reactions range anything from sort of being irritable, afterwards tired, angry, withdrawn. Some people get nightmares and flashbacks. Some people don't. Some people get more anxious. Some people want to isolate away. Some people want to distract more. Some people find new sensitivities afterwards. And we kind of get some of these reactions afterwards as well as during that we just want to be aware of if we start to notice some of these signs that could be an indication something happened that wasn't okay. The next thing that happens is we talked a little bit too, remember that second floor, tend and befriend reactions. Sometimes we end up staying in contact with the person something bad happened with. We might even continue flirting or texting or messaging or whatever, even sometimes asking to hang out. And this can be really confusing to people. They sort of think, well, if something so bad happened with this person, wouldn't I never ever want to see them again? Or wouldn't I hate their guts? Or wouldn't I whatever? But this can happen because our evolutionary system kicks in and it's trying to keep the sort of hunter-gatherer tribe of people together. And if this person's in our tribe, as it were, our little caveman clan kind of thing, we're going to have to continue interacting with them. So we need them to be a safe person. It's almost like that idea of keep your enemies closer. And if you can kind of keep an eye on what's happening with them, your evolutionary system feels safer. If you take care of them or tend or befriend them, your system tends to feel almost like sometimes weirdly safer. Not always. Sometimes you'll have a huge adverse reaction. You'll never want to see this person again. But sometimes it's a bit of a gray area in between, and the transition isn't always immediate. The last thing that can sometimes happen that I've had quite a few people over the years be very confused about if it happens to them is sort of the opposite of what, again, we sometimes expect. We expect sometimes if you have a scary sexual experience, we expect we might be scared or nervous or anxious or not want sexual interaction for a while. Sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes people end up actually becoming more sexually active, having more sexual experiences with more partners. And oftentimes people can find that very confusing. The reason we're doing this is sometimes we're drawn to this feeling of wanting to reclaim our sexual power and choice because something happened that wasn't our choice and that wasn't feeling safe. We can sometimes then kind of recreate sexual experiences in ways where we're the one choosing it. And that can sometimes actually be a sign. Sometimes that's when people, maybe for instance, come to my office for the first time to talk about something, when they've realized they've had quite a few partners and they didn't originally think that was how they wanted to do their sexual journey. And that got them thinking, but it's only after kind of a really long time they started to look back and we're like, that was when everything changed. And then we are able to identify something that their brain didn't originally see as a sexual assault. And when we break down all these steps like we've now done in this course together, that cognitive dissonance is able to turn around and their brain says, oh, okay, that actually wasn't okay. And then they can start healing from it. Okay, so just noticing any of these different reactions are possible. Something also maybe that we haven't even talked about here at all might happen if you've experienced something that's off the radar of this. It still doesn't necessarily mean that what happened wasn't sort of okay. And you should always ask someone if you're ever unsure if something that happened to you wasn't okay. So when we get to that point of sort of during an assault, what it feels like, after an assault, what it might feel like, we also want to look at this idea of getting help. Now, of course, if we do have safe and trusted people in our lives, those are great people usually to start with. Even better sometimes, or at least in addition, is someone who's also trained in this stuff like we've been talking about. Hopefully if a parent has followed along with you in this course and you're comfortable with that person, they now have this extra information on all these different experiences. If you do talk to a counselor or a helpline, especially, they should have some training in this, and they can help you navigate, again, this broad range of experiences and reactions, and make sure you know that whatever you did was the best you knew how to do. There is no guilt or shame around anything you do to try to cope afterwards if something bad happened to you. It really doesn't matter anything that happens after a given moment in a sexual interaction. If consent wasn't there, if you didn't say yes, there doesn't need to be any guilt or shame or blame for anything after that point. So working with someone who has a bit of training can sometimes make sure you get all of this right information. And then there are, in addition, some very specific therapies that can help you heal from stuff. And that can be, immediate or down the road, years later in your life. Their options are always there whenever you feel ready, if you feel ready. There's things like a therapy called EMDR. You can Google it if you're interested. It's a way of sort of reprocessing traumatic stuff that's happened to us. There's some somatic stuff. Somatic means body. So different therapies that involve sort of getting that nervous system back in line that we've talked about, those different sort of parts of your nervous system that get kind of off kilter. So there's different options. Another one's called neurofeedback. That sort of helps your brain waves get back in line. So trying to get your top shelf, your top floor of your house back working a little bit more, like exercising those muscles. Okay, so there's all these options. You don't have to remember each and every one of these fancy terms or approaches, but knowing that they are sort of specific and that they can actually help you heal is good to know you have these options, okay? So as you're sort of doing this is more of a handout for a reference sheet that I've given you for this section than it is a worksheet, because this is a little bit more complicated information. I wanted you to make sure you had it all written down exactly so you could reference it if you ever need to. I also do have a few questions for you to think about at the end there. Just, you might have some thoughts, you might not, just any concerns or questions you have after we've sort of gone through this tough stuff. And just any other sort of thoughts about this, sort of the last video and this one. Just that sort of have gotten you thinking, reflections that you want to make a note to yourself of, points you want to remember, anything you want to sort of bold or underline so it just keeps standing out for you. So that's your sort of handout for this section. Remember that whatever happens, again, if it's for yourself or a friend, you are always, always, always worthy and deserving of getting help that feels safe, that feels comfortable. If for any reason the first time you try to reach out to someone isn't a safe or comfortable experience, please don't let that stop you from continuing to find the right person to talk to about this stuff. They are out there. They will help you. If any kind of not so good reaction comes up the first time you try to speak up about something not so good in your life, I really strongly encourage you to keep looking and to not shut down because you do deserve it. Okay, so this wraps up our part 2. We are going to look now at part 3 of chapter 6, which is the bystander intervention approach. So this is very much about how to help a friend, how to help anyone that you might see who's in trouble, what that looks like, and what to do. So we'll meet there next.